All right, Matthew chapter 4, beginning with verse 12. Here's what it says. Now when he being Jesus, heard that John had been arrested, that's John the Baptist, he withdrew into Galilee. Okay, so let's pause there for just a second. If you remember, when we started this series a couple weeks ago, a significant amount of time had passed from the end of chapter 2 to the beginning of chapter 3. So at the end of chapter 2, Jesus was still a child, and then we get to the beginning of chapter 3, and he's being baptized in the desert by John the Baptist as an adult. And so there's at least 25 plus years that have passed since the end of chapter 2. After which, Jesus immediately goes into the desert to be tempted by the devil. For 40 days he's there, and that's the story we looked at last week. And now here in verse 12, we're told that John the Baptist has been arrested. Now, he wasn't arrested while Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. Okay, this is another one of those time jumps, okay? Only this time the jump is about 12 months or so. See, from the time that Jesus was baptized in the desert by John to the time that he is arrested and crucified is a span of about 3 years. Now, John's gospel is the only gospel that gives us a clue as to what happened during that first year of ministry. But that would have been the time where Jesus performs his first miracle, turning water into wine. It's also during that year is when he had that secret meeting with the Pharisee Nicodemus and explained to him what it means to be born again. And there's a few other stories in there as well that give us some idea of what happened during that first year of ministry. But it wasn't until year 2 that things really started ramping up. And that was the same time that John the Baptist was arrested. So as John's ministry is ending, that's when Jesus' ministry really begins to take off. And so we're told in verse 13 that when this happened, Jesus left Nazareth, the town that he grew up in, and he went and lived in a place called Capernaum by the sea. That's the Sea of Galilee, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. Now, why is that significant? Verse 14, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light. And for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. Okay, so Matthew chooses to begin his account of Jesus' public ministry with this prophecy out of Isaiah that was fulfilled when Jesus left his hometown of Nazareth and set up his base of operations in a small fishing village called Capernaum on the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee. But more important than the location of this place is the spiritual climate of the place. This is an area where people are, quote, dwelling in darkness and the shadow of death, which sounds like a horrible place to live, doesn't it? But see, you wouldn't know that by just looking at the place. I mean, even today, here's a picture of the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee, and I mean, it looks like a beautiful place to live, doesn't it? That doesn't look dark at all. But see, that's because the darkness that Matthew is referring to in this prophecy isn't physical darkness, but a spiritual darkness. Now, granted, the people who were living there were living under the rule of the Roman Empire at the time, and at the time that prophecy was given in Isaiah, they were living under the Assyrian Empire. And so there was political darkness in a sense that the people had to live under. But that's not the darkness that this verse is referring to, because that's not the darkness that Jesus came to save them from. And we know that because of his message. It's the same message that John the Baptist preached. Verse 17, from that time, meaning from the time that John the Baptist was arrested, from that time Jesus began to preach, saying what? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Now, we're not going to get into the meaning of that message this morning. You can go back and watch the sermon that we did on chapter 3 if you like, and you can hear all about that because it's the exact same message that John the Baptist preached. Same message, different messenger. But unlike John the Baptist, who preached this message to prepare the way for the king, Jesus preaches this message as the king. And so where John was a voice crying in the wilderness, Jesus is now the light shining in the darkness. And that light has dawned on the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee. But what exactly is this darkness that Jesus is stepping into? And what does that darkness look like in this region of the world, specifically in this small fishing village that Jesus has decided to set up shop in called Capernaum? Because it doesn't appear to be a very dark place. It appears to be, well, a very comfortable place. In fact, it's interesting, the name Capernaum literally means village of comfort. So, I mean, what's so dark about that, right? People like to be comfortable, strive for it even. We like comfortable clothes and comfortable homes, comfortable beds, right? We like to have comfortable jobs that we're doing and hanging around friends who are comfortable and that we're comfortable being around. I mean, we like comfortable. I like comfortable. And look, there's nothing wrong with comfortable. Comfortable can be a good thing. The problem is when comfortable becomes the only thing, when it becomes the most important thing. Because at that point, comfort isn't just enjoyable anymore. Comfort becomes an excuse. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Yeah, I'm not really comfortable doing that. See, comfort can be darkness if it prevents us from experiencing the light. And Jesus knows that, which is why he confronts comfort head on. I mean, what's more uncomfortable than preaching the same exact message that someone who was just arrested was preaching and then asking others to do the same? I mean, that's about as uncomfortable as you can get. But that's exactly what Jesus is doing here in comfortable Capernaum. And so let's take a look at how Jesus goes about doing this and how those that he confronts with this message respond to it. And maybe we can learn a little something along the way. So picking things up in verse 18, here's what happens next. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. And he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Okay, so first things first. What did these guys do for a living? They were fishermen, right? And why wouldn't they be? They live in a fishing village. And so fishing was something that they were very comfortable doing. In fact, they probably had been doing it their entire lives. I mean, we know for sure that James and John spent their whole lives fishing because their father Zebedee was a fisherman as well. And so for them, this was a family business. Which means when they left to follow Jesus, they didn't just leave their nets behind like Peter and Andrew did. They left an entire business behind, okay, including their dad. Which means from here on out, Zebedee and Sons is going to have to do without the sons. And so these guys left what was familiar to them. They left what was comfortable for them. And they also left what was safe. I mean, not that there wasn't any risks involved in being a fisherman back then, but relatively speaking, it was a pretty safe occupation compared to what Jesus was calling them into next, which, if you know the story, will eventually involve them preaching and casting out demons, which I'm pretty sure none of these guys had any experience in whatsoever. Not to mention the fact that according to the Bible and church tradition, 3 of these 4 fishermen end up being killed, and the 4th is tortured and sent into exile because they followed Jesus. So what these guys are deciding to do here is extremely risky. Some might even say reckless, especially when you consider how quickly they responded to the invitation. Immediately, it says, immediately they left their nets. Immediately, they left their business, they left their family, and they went and followed Jesus. But what does that mean? What is it that these guys were signing up for? Because if you think about it, this is the same call that we've been given, right? In fact, it's part of our mission statement here at CWB, following Jesus together. But what exactly does it look like to follow Jesus? What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at what Jesus says here to his first disciples and unpack this a little bit. In verse 19, Jesus says to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Okay, so the first thing Jesus says to these guys is, "Follow me," which means what? Who goes first in this relationship? Jesus does, right? I mean, you can't follow somebody unless they're in front of you. See, we're going to keep this really simple this morning. I know a lot of you had to shovel snow and drive on really icy roads and stuff, and so you're probably still a little stressed about that. So let's keep this simple. To follow Jesus means that Jesus goes first, okay? So that means he sets the agenda, and he is the one who determines which direction we should go. Otherwise, we're not really following him, are we? I mean, if I say I'm following you, and at some point during the following, you look back and you see I'm going in a totally different direction, am I really following you? No, of course not. And it doesn't matter what I believe, and it doesn't even matter if I agree with the direction you're going and everything you have to say. I'm not really following you unless I'm following you, right? Makes sense? See, I told you we're going to keep this simple. You know, after the resurrection, before Jesus ascends into heaven, he gives his disciples a mission, okay? We see it in the last two verses of the book. And so if you look at those verses in chapter 28, you'll see that the mission that Jesus gives us wasn't simply to teach people the things that Jesus commanded us, but to what? Verse 20, teach people to observe, to do what Jesus commanded us. See, it's not enough just to agree with what Jesus said. That's not following Jesus. Following Jesus is following Jesus. And following requires doing, and doing requires faith. Because the truth is, we're not always ready to do what Jesus is calling us to do. I mean, think about these first disciples. These guys had no idea what the next couple of years were going to be like. And they definitely didn't know what the rest of their lives were going to be like. But see, that's okay, because following Jesus is a process. And right now, for these guys, all they need to have enough faith to do is leave what's familiar and what's comfortable and then follow Jesus wherever it is that he leads them. And they did, and that's what faith looks like. See, here's the cool thing about being a follower of Jesus. There's no driver's test, right? There's no written test. There's no driver's test. Jesus didn't choose these guys because they were great Bible scholars or gifted evangelists and had this whole thing figured out. That's not why he picked them. And he didn't test them first to see if they were qualified. The only qualification was they had to trust him. They had to have faith. Faith to leave comfortable Capernaum and follow Jesus instead. To leave behind their own plans and their own way of doing things and follow him. And that's all any of us are called to do when we first following Jesus. See, things like growth, things like maturity, that happens along the way. Okay, that doesn't happen before we follow Jesus, but as we follow Jesus. So when you become a follower of Jesus, the rest of your life is a learning experience. And we discover more and more what Jesus really means as we follow him. We learn what that following means when we're actually doing it. But it begins by trusting him, by letting Jesus go first and simply having the faith to follow him. So that's the first word that Jesus calls us, the word follow. But the second word is the word me. So Jesus says, follow me. And that's significant because Jesus is calling these guys not to follow some kind of religion or philosophy. He's calling them to follow him. Okay, see, rabbis didn't do that back then. If you followed a rabbi, it was to learn the Torah. It was to be taught from the scriptures, which Jesus does do with his disciples. But see, this is more than that. Jesus isn't calling these guys to follow his teachings. He's calling them to follow him. And notice who's taking the initiative here. This is also something that would have been unusual back then. Rabbis didn't typically go around looking for disciples. Okay, people who were interested in being a disciple would go to them. But here's Jesus taking the initiative, as he does with all of us, and he calls these guys to follow him. And look, when Jesus calls us, he doesn't just call us to sit in a pew and fill our heads full of knowledge. And he doesn't call us to simply improve our lives and make ourselves feel better about ourselves. When Jesus says, follow me, he's not just calling us to follow what he's teaching, but to follow what he's doing. He's calling us to a mission. Follow me, Jesus says, in what? Verse 19? And I will make you fishers of men. See, that's a mission that Jesus is calling us to. That's a job description. Now, I know these guys were fishermen, which is probably why Jesus is using fishing language here, but don't let the illustration get lost on you. When a fisherman catches a fish, there are huge consequences for the fish, right? The fish can't go on living like it did before. I mean, think about what it is exactly that Jesus is calling these guys to do. First off, what Jesus is calling them to do is exactly what he's doing right now. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus is calling these guys to become fishers of men, but Jesus is the one doing the fishing. He's the one catching them. And notice how he's doing it. He's passing along the side of the Sea of Galilee. He's walking along the shoreline where the fishermen are. Okay, he's not back at the temple. He's not in a synagogue waiting for potential disciples to come to him, but he's on the shores of Galilee where the people are. Similarly, when Simon and Andrew and James and John go fishing, they don't put a sign out in front of their house that says, "Fish are welcome here," and just expect them to show up, right? What do? They get in the water. They either walk in like Simon and Andrew did with their nets, or they go out in a boat like James and John. But what they don't do is they don't wait for the fish to come to them. And so when Jesus says, I'm going to make you fishers of men, these guys may not understand everything that that's going to entail, but they at least understand that it's going to require them to leave where they're at, to leave comfortable Capernaum and go out to where the people are. Because they're fishermen. And so they at least understand that much. They at least understand that this calling is going to destroy. And so the question is, when we tell people about Jesus, do they really understand what's expected of them? Or do we talk about Jesus in such a way that he comes across to people more like an accessory to their life than a disruption of their life? In other words, is following Jesus something you can just add to your life like an accessory, like an option on a car? Or is it a whole new way of living? See, the response we're supposed to have to the gospel is repent. Leave what is comfortable, which is trusting in ourselves, and then follow Jesus instead. And when we dumb that down to something shallow, like just pray this prayer, believe these 3 things, and show up to church twice a month, we end up giving people something that honestly they don't need and is not worth having. And guess what? They eventually figure that out, and they end up walking away. See, people don't need a new religion. What they need is a new life. Now, it may not always be a comfortable life, but it is a life worth living. And that's why this fishing illustration is so perfect, because ultimately the call to follow Jesus is a call to die. To die to ourselves and our own way of doing things, and to live for him. And even though these 4 fishermen didn't understand everything that they were getting themselves into, they understood that much. They understood that they needed to die to the life that was comfortable to them in order to embrace this new life in him. And this new calling, to go from being a fisherman to a fisher of men, is a pretty significant career change. Would you agree? But notice here that Jesus doesn't tell these guys to follow him so he can simply tell them how to become a fisher of men. He says here in verse 19, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." And that word make is meant to convey the idea of creating something, not controlling something. Okay, in other words, it's not like saying, "I'm going to make you clean that up." Okay, it's not like you better do this or else. This is, I'm going to make you into something. I'm going to recreate you and make you into something new. And in this case, it's from fishermen into fishers of men. See, once we understand how involved Jesus is in this whole process, that he doesn't just stand back at a distance and say, "Follow me," and then expect us to do it all on our own, but he actually empowers us every step of the way. When we finally understand that, it's so empowering and so freeing. I don't have to be worried anymore if I make any mistakes along the way. See, because later on in this story, when we see these two brothers, James and John, let their pride get in the way and begin to engage in a power struggle with the other disciples, and when we see all the disciples complaining that they don't have enough bread to eat, right after seeing Jesus feed thousands of people with a few loaves and fish. And then there's Peter, who later on will deny that he even knows who Jesus is. When we see these things play out, it's so easy to get discouraged and think, wait a minute, these guys are going to become fishers of what again? But because it's Jesus who chooses them, and because it's the Son of God who calls them, these fishermen really do become fishers of men. And they end up changing the world. See, this invitation, this call that Jesus gave to his disciples, it ends up changing their lives forever. And it's a call that can still change lives today. If we're only willing to leave behind what is comfortable, take a risk, and respond to Jesus' call to come follow me.